It was New Year's Eve back in 2017. I'm from Ohio, just outside of Cleveland, and I had just finished up a semester at the University of Rochester. Due to some personal reasons, I had to stay back a week after the semester ended, which meant spending Christmas alone. By the time I boarded my flight home, I was already in a sour mood. Adding to the misery, the Cleveland Browns, my team since childhood, had just lost their final game of the season, making them the first team since the 1980s to go 0-16. It was a unique kind of heartbreak only a Browns fan would understand. To top it off, my flight got delayed, which threw a wrench in my family's New Year's plans. My parents, unable to wait for me, decided to head to my cousin's house for a party, leaving me to make the trip alone. My mom left our golden retriever, Vera, behind to keep me company, which was a small comfort. By the time my Uber dropped me off at home, it was almost 10 p.m. I didn't even bother unpacking. I just tossed my luggage in the car, grabbed Vera, locked the house, and hit the road. The drive was uneventful at first, just miles of quiet Ohio backroads cutting through open fields and patches of forest. A light dusting of snow covered the ground, and the only illumination came from my headlights and the occasional faint glow of a farmhouse porch light. About halfway into the trip, Vera started whining. At first, I thought she was just bored, but then she started pacing in the passenger seat. That's when I realized she needed to go. I sighed, pulling over at a small clearing. It was barely large enough to park the car, but it would have to do. The darkness around me felt suffocating, the kind that swallows sound and sight. Only the faint patches of snow broke the black void. I let Vera out without bothering to leash her. She sniffed around the edge of the woods, taking her time. I stood there, shoving my hands into my jacket pockets, trying not to freeze. Vera didn't seem to care about the cold or the eerie silence. Classic golden retriever. That's when I heard it. A crashing sound came from deep within the woods, startling me. It wasn't the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves. It was heavier, deliberate, like someone moving through the trees. My heart jumped into my throat as I peered into the darkness, trying to spot anything beyond the first line of trees. Before I could process what I had heard, Vera bolted into the woods. Panic gripped me. I called her name over and over, but she didn't come back. The fear of losing her overwhelmed me, and without thinking, I ran after her. The dim light from my phone flashlight barely lit the path ahead, and the thin layer of snow on the ground wasn't much help. I stumbled through the trees, yelling for her, ignoring the rising fear that something was out there. Eventually, I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, on the verge of breaking down. Then, I saw her. Vera was crouched low, shivering, with her tail tucked tightly between her legs. I dropped to my knees, relief washing over me as she pressed against me, trembling. Whatever had scared her was unlike anything she had encountered before. I quickly realized we weren't safe. The woods were still too quiet, and the air felt heavy with a sense of danger. I urged Vera to follow me as I tried to retrace my steps back to the car. She stayed close this time, her fear palpable. Then, I heard it again, the crashing sound. But this time, it was closer. My heart raced as I realized it was following us. I didn't think so. I just ran, my legs moving before my brain could process what was happening. Vera darted ahead, and I followed her, the sound of crashing branches growing louder behind me. Somehow, by pure luck or instinct, Vera led me back to the car. I threw open the door and practically shoved her inside before jumping in myself. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but before I could start the car, I made the mistake of looking back toward the woods. There, standing at the edge of the trees, were three figures. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. I floored it, speeding away without looking back. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. A few miles down the road, I noticed Vera was bleeding. There was a cut just below her shoulder blade, clean and deliberate, as if someone had stabbed her. My stomach dropped. I pulled over, digging through the trunk for the first aid kit my mom always kept in the car. I cleaned and dressed Vera's wound as best I could, my hands trembling the entire time. She whimpered softly, but I knew I had to keep going. Once her wound was wrapped, I got back behind the wheel and drove straight to my cousin's house. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my parents, not my relatives. Even now, I don't fully understand what I saw or why it happened. It's the kind of thing you carry with you in silence, hoping you'll never have to experience it again. A few years ago, on New Year's Eve, I was driving to visit my parents at their house in rural upstate Pennsylvania. It was supposed to be a simple trip, about a 3-hour drive. I'd left in the late afternoon, planning to get there well before midnight to ring in the new year together. The drive started out peaceful. I've always enjoyed long drives, and the quiet time on the road felt like a much-needed chance to clear my head. But as I was about an hour into the trip, the weather started to change. At first, it was light flurries, nothing to worry about. In fact, the snow looked pretty, dusting the trees and fields along the highway. I even found myself thinking how nice it was to experience a white New Year's Eve. But it didn't take long for the snow to pick up. The flurries turned into a steady snowfall, and soon I was driving through a full-blown blizzard. The roads became slick, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. My little sedan wasn't built for conditions like this. The tires started slipping on even small inclines, and I knew I couldn't keep going. It wasn't safe. I found a spot on the shoulder to pull over, far enough from the road to avoid any passing vehicles. Not that there were many out in that weather. I texted my parents to let them know I'd had to stop and wouldn't make it there anytime soon. They were worried, but I told them I'd wait for the storm to pass before deciding what to do. As the hours dragged on, the snow didn't ease up. If anything, it got worse. The wind howled, and snow began piling up around my car, making me feel even more trapped. I tried to conserve my gas by turning the engine on and off every so often to stay warm, but I knew I couldn't do that all night. The isolation started to weigh on me. I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease as I sat there, listening to the storm. Then, through the swirling snow, I saw headlights approaching from behind. Relief washed over me. Someone was coming. As the lights drew closer, I realized it was a snowplow. It pulled up beside my car, and the driver rolled down his window. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with a weathered face and a thick knit hat pulled low over his ears. He had a gruff voice, the kind that suggested years of smoking, and asked if I was okay. I explained my situation, and he nodded thoughtfully. He said I wouldn't get far in the storm with my car, and offered to give me a ride to safety. I hesitated. Something about him made me uneasy, but at the same time, staying in my car all night wasn't an option. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the plow. The warmth was a welcome change, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax. The man didn't talk much as we started driving. I gave him directions to my parents' house, and he nodded, but something felt off. After a few minutes, I noticed we weren't going in the right direction. I double-checked the GPS on my phone, and it confirmed my suspicion. He was taking me the opposite way. I asked him, as calmly as I could, if we were heading the right way. Without looking at me, he said we were taking a detour and that the back roads were safer than the highway. My gut told me something was wrong. I glanced around the cab, trying not to be obvious, and noticed some red flags. Empty liquor bottles on the floor, torn-up maps stuffed in the side pockets, and, most unsettling of all, a large knife wedged between the seats. My heart started pounding, and I felt trapped. The snowstorm outside made it impossible to just get out and walk. As we drove further, I spotted a faint glow in the distance, a house. It was the first one I'd seen in miles, and I knew it might be my only chance. I waited until we were close, then took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and flung the door open. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I jumped out, landing hard in the snow, pain shooting through my leg. I scrambled to my feet and started running toward the house. The man yelled after me, but I didn't stop. I could hear him fumbling with something in the cab, but I didn't look back. I kept running until I reached the front door of the house and pounded on it, screaming for help. A middle-aged couple opened the door, and without hesitation, they pulled me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, breathless and shaking, and told them what had happened. They immediately called the police. By the time the officers arrived, the snowplow was gone. They said they'd searched the area, but in those conditions, it was unlikely they'd find him. The couple offered me a place to stay for the night, and the next morning, they helped me contact someone to tow my car. I eventually made it to my parents' house, shaken but safe. To this day, I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't jumped out of that truck when I did. I've never been much of a party person. Even during college, I always preferred spending time with a few close friends over loud, crowded events. Growing up in rural Manitoba, I got used to the quiet. My dad had this tradition of going ice fishing every New Year's Eve, and it became something of a family event. My mom wasn't in the picture much, so it was usually just me, my dad, and a couple of his close friends. After my dad passed away, I kept the tradition alive. It felt like a way to stay connected to him. My two closest friends, Jake and Will, always joined me. Both of them were the outdoorsy types, rough around the edges but reliable. We'd load up our gear in Jake's truck, a sturdy, beat-up pickup that had seen its fair share of snowy back roads, and head to a lake we'd found years ago. It was a secluded spot, surrounded by dense pine forest, and we liked it that way. Fewer people meant fewer interruptions. That year, we planned everything like usual. Ice augers, fishing rods, a small propane heater, and plenty of food. The forecast called for clear skies, but you learn quickly not to trust winter weather reports in Manitoba. We were ready for anything, or so we thought. The drive out was uneventful, the three of us chatting and laughing as we navigated the snow-packed roads. As we neared the lake, I noticed something odd, a figure standing at the trailhead. He was bundled up in heavy winter gear, his face obscured by a scarf and a hood. At first, I figured it was just another angler, but as we got closer, something about his posture felt wrong. He was completely still, just staring at us. Jake muttered something about how creepy it was, and I had to agree. Still, we didn't think much of it. People acted strange sometimes, especially out in the middle of nowhere. As we parked and started unloading the truck, the figure suddenly moved toward us. He waved his arms, signaling us to stop what we were doing. When he got closer, I could see his eyes. They were wide with panic. "Please, you have to help me," the person yelled, his voice muffled by the scarf. My friend fell through the ice. "He's out there, and I can't get to him." The desperation in his voice was impossible to ignore. Jake and Will immediately stopped what we were doing, and before I could suggest grabbing any of our gear, we were all following this stranger down the trail toward the lake. The urgency in his voice drowned out any second thoughts. As we approached the lake, I started to notice something wasn't right. We weren't heading to the usual fishing spots where the ice was thickest. Instead, the stranger was leading us toward a more remote part of the shoreline. The trees grew closer together here, casting eerie shadows over the snow. I was about to voice my concerns when we came to a sudden stop. Ahead of us, standing near the edge of the lake, were two more figures. They weren't dressed for fishing. No gear, no jackets suitable for the freezing temperatures. They stood perfectly still, watching us. My stomach dropped when I noticed the glint of metal in one of their hands. A gun. "Stop right there," one of them barked, raising the weapon. My heart pounded as the realization hit me. We'd been lured into a trap. The stranger we'd followed turned to face us, his panic replaced with a smug grin. "Empty your pockets," one of the armed men ordered, "and toss your keys." Jake, Will, and I exchanged nervous glances. There wasn't much we could do. Slowly, we complied, tossing our keys and phones onto the snow. One of the men picked them up, laughing to himself. "City boys," he muttered, shaking his head. I felt a mix of fear and rage bubbling inside me, but I knew better than to act on it. One wrong move, and this could end badly. The men motioned for us to head back toward the trailhead, their weapons trained on us the entire time. They stayed behind as we walked, probably waiting to ensure we were far enough away before taking off. When we got back to the truck, it was gone. Just an empty patch of snow where it had been parked. The three of us stood there in stunned silence, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. Jake, ever resourceful, pulled out a second phone he'd kept in his jacket pocket. He'd lied about not having one, and for once, I was grateful for his paranoia. He called the police, explaining everything as best he could. The dispatcher told us to stay put and wait for help, so we huddled together for warmth, trying to process what had just happened. The shock gave way to frustration. Jake paced back and forth, muttering curses under his breath, while Will stared off into the distance, his face pale. The cops eventually arrived and took our statements, but there wasn't much they could do. The truck and our belongings were gone, and the likelihood of catching those guys was slim. They gave us a ride back to town, where we spent the rest of the night nursing our bruised egos. To this day, we still talk about that night, trying to piece together what happened. Were we just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or had those men been waiting for someone to show up? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I'll never look at those quiet, secluded fishing spots the same way again. What would you have done? From eerie figures lurking in the woods to a mysterious snowplow detour and a chilling trap by the frozen lake, these New Year's Eve stories leave us with unsettling questions. Would you have gone after Vera into the woods? Could you trust a stranger offering a ride during a blizzard? How would you react if led into a trap like the ice fishing crew? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed these spine-chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more real-life horror stories you won't forget. Stay tuned for more thrilling content.